have a few questions to put to the speakers.
Yeah. So am I okay to start? I'll start with
Yep.
Sada. So this is effectively, it's the same question from two people. I'll give you both of the phrasings, but it's effectively the same question. So Chris Jarman asks, was it really a single system of law across the Marcher Lordships, or did it vary from lordship to lordship? And Rosalind Caird asks, since Marcher law borrowed from English and Welsh law, was it ever codified? And if so, did it vary from lordship to lordship?
It's quite a simple answer, really. So yes, it varied from lordship to lordship. It wasn't a single body of law, and it wasn't codified in one place. So if you look back at Rhys Davis's article, he shows that you have to look at various sources to get a full overview of, well, to get an overview of what the law of the marsh was. But it depends on where you're looking, what you're looking at, which lordship you're looking at. So it's not, Magna Carta is slightly misleading in that sense, in that it sort of lists it as, yeah, Marcher law, but it's not a thing, if you know what I mean. It's varying customs for different lordships, different regions, different peoples within the lordships, because you'd have different rules for the Welsh and for the English in some lordships. Yeah. So it's not a thing. It's not a single entity in any way, shape or form, and it's not codified neatly anywhere.
Excellent, thanks. Well, now, unfortunately, or fortunately, David, I'm afraid all of the remaining questions I have are for you. They're addressed to you anyway. But I think others can chip in if they like, and if anybody else wants to stick around.
Yes, 5 or 10,
Okay,
5 or 10
right,
minutes.
so
10 minutes.
first,
That would take us to
my first
1:15.
question is from, oh, sorry, the plane is about to come over at Heathrow, so if you can't hear me, I'll repeat. So Daniela asks, did the Welsh of the Principality consider those Welsh that were loyal to the Marcher Lords as traitors?
I think that is certainly something that comes out in some of the historiography. Whether it was the case at the time, it is certainly the case that the 13th century poets do a pretty good job of stigmatizing anybody who's Welsh and who doesn't accept the dominion of the Llywelyns. That is a recurrent theme. It is, in a sense, almost the duty of every Welsh person to accept that their proper ruler is the Prince of Gwynedd. Now, you know, basically, you tell that to a Marcher lord, you tell that to a ruler of Powys, you tell that to one of the survivors in the lands between Wye and Severn, and they'll have a completely different story. But of course, in 13th century terms, as opposed to poetry, it emanates eventually from Gwynedd. And so that is a sense that we have, and we have to guard against accepting that sense for anywhere except Gwynedd. I think that the poets did a very good job in persuading people within Gwynedd that they, in a sense, had what I might almost term as an imperialistic claim to the rest of Wales. That's a tendentious sort of word, imperialistic, to use, but I'll stick with it. Whereas in other parts of Wales, when the people from Gwynedd turn up and establish rule, there is resistance. There is resistance on a regional and a local level. And that indicates that some significant figures in other parts of Wales, I'm not saying everyone, but some significant figures were very much inclined to oppose the pretensions of Gwynedd, and as a consequence, they were stigmatized as being unreliable. Of Gwynedd were asked, or people of Gwynedd were asked, who do you want? Do you want a proper Welshman, i.e. somebody called Llywelyn? Or do you want a Frenchman, somebody who's married into a French-speaking Marcher family? And the finger there was being pointed, you know, specifically at people like Gwynwen of Powys. So It depends how you're counting, as they say. It depends who you're listening to. People in the Welsh people in the March who are loyal to Marcher Lords are therefore not properly Welsh. But that's you get a different sense when you look at the March itself.
That's a really, I mean, that's a really interesting point. I wonder how much they're borrowing from English kings as sort of, you know, the English nation itself kind of solidify around this time.
I think there's a definite attempt to do just that. Yeah. But what we're running into is you're not getting the degree of regnal solidarity that you get in England. Instead, what you're getting increasingly is lordship solidarities, and that's a different picture entirely.
Excellent. Sorry, that's the latest plane going over it at my end. Right, next question's from Connor Williams. So David mentioned that increasingly by the 14th century, the Marcher Lordships were becoming monopolised by certain families. To what extent do you think this was a deliberate strategy by Marcher Lords to keep their kind of communities and powers insular, or was it accidental due to the failure of heirs or a variety of other factors?
When we talk about being monopolised by specific families, are we talking about the lords themselves?
I'm assuming, as you mentioned, the Mortimers and the FitzAlans, and that's my assumption.
It's okay. It is a tendency, certainly, for obviously hereditary lordship to take place. There's a tendency, in other words, for families to stick around. But on the other hand, there is a terrific mortality rate amongst Marcher families in the 14th century. This is something that Rhys Davies, again, he's here in spirit. He certainly is, but it's something that Rhys mentioned. In fact, in his book on lordship and society in the 14th century, basically in Wales, he gives a list of the lordly families that simply become extinct in the 14th century, and it's a long list. This is, of course, not unusual. Royal lines become extinct all over Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. They get replaced by new families. Sometimes they accelerate the process by killing their predecessors. In urban societies in general, particularly in England, it's very difficult to find an urban magnate family that lasts for more than 4 generations, and most don't make 4. Most make 2 or 3 generations of control, and then they're gone. They're wiped out. Disease, the lot. In the case of the Welsh March, obviously there's a degree of turbulence which doesn't help magnate survival. There are executions. You've only got to look in the as far as the 14th century is concerned, you've only got to look at the execution of Thomas of Lancaster after Boroughbridge in 1322. You look at the death of Humphrey de Bohun in the course of Boroughbridge in 1322. The Mortimers had already given up the ghost. They'd already surrendered by Boroughbridge. And so, they're ensconced in the various prisons and then ultimately the Tower of London. That's what happens to Marcher families. It was an interesting life. It was a potentially very rewarding life to be a Marcher Lord, but the chances were that it would be a short life.
And I've put up the slide that illustrated the concentration of lordships within certain families,
and that's to a certain extent a product of the demise of previous families. It's a process that goes on, so that by the time we're in the 15th century, we talked about this gap in the record, but in the 15th century, you really do have a concentration of lordships in a very few hands. That becomes the norm.
And of course, then a further consequence of that is that they then fall into the hands of the crown. So that swathe of Mortimer lordships on the death of the 5th Earl of March in 1425, when he died childless.
Absolutely.
Then the Mortimer inheritance passed to their nephew Richard, Duke of York.
Becomes Yorkist,
and of course, and then to his son Edward, Earl of March, who became King Edward IV. So at that point, that swathe of Mortimer lordships became into the ownership of the crown. Similarly, Lancastrian lordships had also become the property of the crown, which again is one aspect that made it easier for Henry VIII to abolish the powers of the Marcher Lordships, because the crown held so many of them anyway.
He was the Marcher Lordships. I mean, by the time that Henry gets at it, there's so few left. As you say, it's easy.
So, Paul?
Yeah, I've got one more substantial question, which maybe John might like to also comment on, perhaps, because it relates to the comparison between Wales and Ireland. So it's from Owen Keane, and he asks David in the first instance, so you drew a loose distinction between those Welsh leaders who sought stable relations with their neighbouring Lords Marcher and those who thrived on war. Now, a similar distinction has been observed in Ireland, where rival claimants to particular Gaelic kingships sometimes exhibited polar opposite attitudes to their English neighbours. Do you feel that individual Welsh rulers tended to adhere to one of those philosophies of lordship, i.e. war or stability, or to fluctuate between them as circumstances changed?
I've got a very short answer to that, and they fluctuated overwhelmingly. Because if you were going to be a successful ruler in what was intrinsically an unstable situation, you had to duck and weave. You had to adapt your policies according to the predominant circumstances, or according to the opportunities that you could perceive. And therefore, we see in very quick succession, in some instances in Wales, we see rulers, and I'm thinking particularly of the Llywelyns here, acting as, if you like, peacemakers, and then suddenly going along with a different push from within their realms and becoming quite aggressive and becoming liable to engage in raiding. They will move quickly from negotiation for truces or for a peace, and if that's not working, then they'll go with the push from inside the principality for action and plunder and blood. And if that then seems to be leading to a serious situation, they'll go back to negotiation again. And so what you've got is a pattern of different impelling forces from within Welsh principalities. You know, sometimes the hawks are in charge, sometimes the doves are in charge. And then you've got also a different pattern of opportunities that Welsh rulers can perceive, and their reigns as princes tend to be a roller coaster ride between those opposites and those different imperatives that they perceive.
Okay, excellent.
I'll duck out for anyone else at this point.
I don't know, John, did you want to say anything, or you're muted, John?
I think I would agree with that, certainly. And I don't know too much about Ireland. Ireland was probably a bit more warlike, and they tended to be a little bit more stubborn in that way. But certainly, what David said about Wales is absolutely true. With all the Western Welsh princes, they were certainly flexible.
In terms again of Rhys Davies, he liked to line up Scotland and England as the societies which had a degree of regnal solidarity, as opposed to Wales and Ireland, where you get glimpses of that, but you also get glimpses of something very, very different indeed. Yeah. And I think that the mixed messages we are getting from Ireland do fit very nicely into the sort of template of what's happening in Wales. I think they are in some ways quite kindred societies.
Yeah, and I think he and Robin Frame have both kind of gone on the Wales and Ireland comparison quite strongly, haven't they? So
Yeah, absolutely.
Philip, I have no further questions unless there are others from the panel that wanted to ask things of each other.
I think it's nearly 1:20, and I'm conscious that people are having to leave, so it's probably time to wrap up. I've just got a couple of announcements, but first of all, a big thank you to all the speakers. Just popping up on my screen are messages from some people who have left, and I think it's summed up by one person who has said, "A brilliant and inspiring morning, so many thanks to all." And I'll just add my thanks to David, Sarah, Kirsten, and John.
Philip, sorry to interrupt, Philip, but just to make sure that this is said, I think all of us, including the speakers in the audience, should thank you and the organising team for this particular event. This is the first time the Mortimer History Society has done something. I know from my own experience how successful the in-person events are, and obviously not to be able to deliver those is a big shame for us all. But the way this has been run, I was in on the practices. It's been run really well this morning. I hope everybody here has enjoyed themselves, and I think we should thank Philip and all of the other officers of the society for organising and making it such a successful morning.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Paul.